And I'd like to welcome everyone here today to the CSRH seminar series. I want to start by acknowledging that we are conducting this seminar on the unceded lands of the Bidjigal people, the lands on which the UNSW Kensington campus stands, and where I'm working on Bidjigal lands today as well. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present here today. You may also want to acknowledge the First Nations owners of the land you are currently on, given that you may be located elsewhere, so please feel free to pop that into the chat. And so today's seminar will describe the use of novel research translation to change public attitudes. I've been privy to see the making of the narrated pieces that will be discussed in today's talk, and I'm pretty excited to hear an update on the shifts in public attitudes stemming from this work. So we have 4 different speakers joining us today. We have Dr. Kerryn Drysdale and Dr. Tim Broady from the Center for Social Research and Health. We also have Meera Atkinson, who is a literary writer, interdisciplinary researcher, and educator, and Bindi Andrews, a queer woman and an artist, and also a peer worker and health education officer. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and I'll now hand over to Tim.
Thanks. So I'll take the start of this. Welcome everyone. I'm so pleased to be joining you from Gadigal land, where it has been a somewhat soggy day, but I'm sure that that there are some benefits to that. I think my garden is well and truly soaked, but maybe we'll hold out for a happier, sunnier day in the coming future. I also just want to acknowledge the wider research team that's involved in this project, and I also noticed that we have Rochelle joining us today as well, and so acknowledging the amazing work that Rochelle did as an intern on this project as well. So thanks again to the CSRH seminar conveners for the opportunity to present this. Tim, could we move to the next slide? So just a very quick background. You know, over 50% of people incarcerated in Australia report pre-incarceration history of injecting drug use. And among prison entrants with a history of injecting drug use, 8 out of 10 reported prior incarceration. So we can see that there's a very cyclical, embedded kind of relationship between drugs and justice involvement. Crimes committed by people who use drugs relating to drug offences typically attract shorter sentences, and so the rate of reincarceration is high. Recent Australian data underscores that link between injecting drug use, involvement with the criminal justice system, and an extraordinarily high rate of recidivism. So this typical pattern of numerous episodes of incarceration and shorter sentences among people who inject drugs highlights the crucial need to exploit these opportunities to interrupt this cycle. Now, around 40,000 people are released every year from prison, at least 16,000 of which are estimated to return to prison at least once in the subsequent 10 years. So when combined with prisoners on remand and then released, the number of justice involved people in Australia far exceeds those currently in prison. And that's an estimated 385,000 people, or 1.8% of the Australian population have been incarcerated. Next slide, please. So very briefly, participants were recruited for this particular qualitative study, which was an interview-based project from a longitudinal cohort study called Supermix, based in Melbourne and the surrounding suburbs. We recruited 48 individuals that had been involved in Supermix, and they were invited to participate in the qualitative interview. And you can see here that their eligibility requirements was that they served a prison term of greater than 3 months. This means that if they were holding rented or social housing, that might have been disrupted and contributing to issues experiencing homelessness, but also that they were released in the previous 12 months, so that those newly released experiences are foremost in their minds. And all of the participants had a history of injecting drug use. Now, what we were trying to do here was a convenience sample by looking at different modes of substance use, different housing experiences, including whether they were vulnerable, stable, or transiently housed. And so the attempt here was to get a fairly comprehensive sample of participants. Next slide, thanks, Tim. I'm going to quickly outline the process because, look, I'm sure that you actually want to hear from the writer and the performer of these narrative pieces more than me. But I just do want to reiterate, this was quite an involved process. And I think Meera has referred to it as writing by committee. So you can see the first step was that we developed a concept sheet and workshopped this with the research team. We then recruited a community advisory group through existing networks to oversee the entire project. We workshopped the themes with the advisory group, and then we went back to the transcripts to find relevant excerpts from each of the transcripts that match those themes. Next slide, please, Tim. Then we engaged artists who were sensitive to these themes, and they were commissioned to produce written artistic interpretations by drawing on those excerpts from blended anonymised transcripts. And this was a really iterative process that did involve a lot of feedback from both the research team and the community advisory group. The outcome was 3 written pieces that conveyed these themes by drawing on the experiences of research participants. And as we've seen in Meera's case, that these artistic narratives were publishable in their own right as a product of artistic endeavour. So in this case, the piece that we're going to play to you today went on to be published in a literary journal. Next slide, thanks, Tim. The process wasn't ended at that point. We then put out a call out for community members with lived experience to participate in the process of bringing these written pieces to life. So 4 people were then invited to participate in rehearsals with the award-winning theatre director, Lisa Marie Siren, before performing these pieces in our new UNSW recording studio. Next slide, thanks. Finally, we engaged Carol and Craig, who you may recognise from the Underbelly series, to host the 3-part series. And she provided the intro and I guess the sort of explainer that went after each of those performed pieces. And this was done by drawing on relevant literature to make sure that we can reiterate how grounded these themes and these narrative pieces were in the actual literature in this area. Next slide, thanks, Tim. So what we have is evocative and compelling narratives that illustrate difficulties faced and the strategies that people use to aid successful reintegration into community. It was really important for us that in conveying some of the difficulties that people face in the post-release period, that we also provided hope. And so a lot of the narratives also provided strategies that our research participants told us that they used to overcome some of these challenges. And so we're hoping that these narratives can be used as an effective resource for services and incarcerated people alike to help mitigate some of these challenges in this post-release context. But as Tim will go on to explain, there's also an added benefit in producing these in our attempt to change public opinion on people who use drugs and formerly incarcerated people. So next slide, thanks, Tim. This is just a snapshot of the involvement that we had among numerous stakeholders to produce these pieces. So absolute credit to everyone who was involved in this, because it was an incredibly inspiring experience, really working with our community advisory group and our writers and performers to ensure that what we had was a really compelling and evidence-based narrative. In the next slide, Tim, we're just going to play you an excerpt of one of the pieces that we'll be talking about today.
All right, I did have a quick trial of playing this video and making the sound work, so fingers crossed this will work properly. Give me a shout if things don't work properly.
I didn't have big plans for when I got out. I couldn't see the future. I just wanted to take it slow and stay off the ice, and being in that domestic violent relationship, my priority was to get him out of my house as quick as I could. I don't want to go back to jail. The day of my release, I had to go to Centrelink, and I waited 3 hours, as you do, and at the end of the day I realised I hadn't eaten. So I went to the community health centre, but once I got there, I didn't know what to say. There was just so much swirling around my head. I didn't know what to do. Your heart's racing. It's natural adrenaline. You're on high alert. You're tense. You go from being looked after and 3 meals a day, everything done for you, and then one day you're out and on your own, and it's overwhelming. You have to make just so many decisions, and you don't know how to make them. You think there could have been someone to say, look, before you go, here's some numbers to help you sort out the basics. Because coming out of prison, you have one appointment after another. It gets to you, you know. For people to change, to not go, the same way they used to, they need accommodation and support and money while they get back on their feet. When he wouldn't leave, I slept rough. There are fights at the housing refuge. And it's loud, people snore, they kick you, they walk over you while you're trying to sleep. And so now I avoid the rooming houses because of that drama and drugs. I know I can always say no, but when you're worn out, I can always say no. But when it's in front of you, it's really hard. Sometimes I feel like a failure. Sometimes I even wanted to go back, to be honest. Yeah, I did. I use ICE for reasons. Reasons. When I got out, them reasons, they were all still there. You feel like shit because your past is just drugs, crime and jail, that whole cycle. No positives, nothing that makes your self-esteem go up a bit, And sometimes the services don't understand just how much there is for you to manage, how much of a challenge it is to stay clean and turn your life around. I have this CCO worker, and every appointment I don't want to go, but I suck it up because I don't want to go back to jail. I have palpitations and I feel sick, because I know I'm going to get the rundown of just how crappy my life is, and I already know that. It's so draining, to be honest, being judged. Like people set out to be drug addicts. Like I'm a loser for not having it all together. One slip, they stamp you for life. I started seeing a drug and alcohol counsellor earlier on, but that did not work out. Because, to be honest, my partner wouldn't let me leave the house. I needed to find someone to unload on. Doesn't matter who it is, anyone really. They don't even have to understand. Just someone to listen. That's all. It's really just knowing someone is there. Anyway, I got away, and now I'm living day by day, and I'm staying away from the friends that I used to hang out with, trying to be more confident. And I want to set some goals, get a good routine going, look for work, keep busy, help me stay off the drugs, because I want to get my kid back. I know I need help, but I don't know where to turn. I mean, they do try to help, but there's a different service for everything. A different person that I have to explain myself to and jump through those hoops for every single one. I just wish there was one place, one person that could help you with it all. It's hard to stop beating myself up, but I'm doing my best, trying not to worry about the past too much. I'm trying to look forward, but it's not easy when you feel you could sleep for a whole week. Trying to have hope, but it's tough. Turn things around because I'm just so tired. Yeah, so tired.
What were you?
So I have to admit, I've heard this so many times, and it still gets me every time I listen to it, just about how emotional that those experiences are. And just to reiterate that a lot of the words used in this narrative were taken directly from the excerpts, from transcripts. So these are our participants' voices, really, that we've been using as part of this. Tim, do you want to slip to the next slide?
I've heard is how exhausting the short-term.
It's tricky when it's playing. This is really why we're here today, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce the heart and soul of the narrative piece that you've just heard. I'd like to introduce Meera and Bindi. Meera Atkinson is a literary writer, an interdisciplinary researcher and educator. Her work has appeared in so many publications that it's quite difficult to list, but she's also the author of the non-fiction titled Traumata, the Poetics of Transgenerational Trauma and Traumatic Effect. And Bindi Andrews is a queer woman who has witnessed the trauma and long-term impacts that incarceration can leave. And so she embraces the creative use of arts to tell hers and other stories. And she serves her community, as always, as a peer and education officer. So I'd just like Bindi and Meera to turn their cameras on and unmute themselves. And Tim, if you wouldn't mind dropping down that slide, if we could have Meera and Bindi pinned on the screen, that'd be fantastic. So I really want to thank you for your time today. It's really, really appreciated. I want to ask you if you could tell me a little bit about what attracted you to this project and why you decided to participate. And maybe we'll start with Meera, if that's okay.
Sure. What attracted me to the project? Well, you know, it might be interesting for people to know. Kerryn and I know each other from around the academic tracks and share a research interest in along affect lines. So Kerryn got in touch with me when she was first looking to put together a creative team to work on this non-traditional output project, and just feeling out sort of what, you know, how she might kind of go about that, looking for an organisation to organise that. And we had a little back and forth around that. And as soon as she told me what the project was about, I was really, really interested immediately. For several reasons. I mean, one, because, you know, I feel a connection with this issue. It's public knowledge. I've written about it before, and I like to speak about it when it's appropriate, like it is today, because I think it's really important to challenge the shame and the stigma around it. But I have a history of problematic youthful substance use, and so it really, and I didn't ever do prison, but I did do rehab, and I know what it's like to come out of an institutionalized setting and have to, you know, build your life from scratch, having been kind of subjectively deconstructed. So I connected with it on that level immediately, but also as an academic, you know, a creative writer first and foremost, but also an academic whose primary discipline is creative writing. I was really, really excited to hear about people in a sort of, you know, STEM-y sort of area. I don't know, quite qualified. I see you as STEM. Anyway, I was quite excited to see people coming from a kind of direction I wouldn't expect to be wanting to use non-traditional research, because, you know, in creative writing, when that's your sort of primary field, you live and breathe non-traditional research, even if you do a lot of scholarly stuff like I do. So yeah, on all those levels, it really appealed to me. So I sort of foisted myself on Kerryn, really. She was kind of feeling out leads for how to find other writers, and I was like, hey, what about me? So kind of
always had to be mine, Meera, always.
Yeah, so I kind of invited myself to the party, and yeah, that's how it all got rolling.
And Bindi, now this I also know Bindi in my private life as well, and so I don't wish to think this is just you know, me, you know, tapping on my friends' shoulders to say please join in. But I mean, Bindi, you were really keen to be involved in this project from the outset, I think. Can you talk to me a little bit about what interested you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I did offer my services for anything that you were doing, because I will always say yes to this sort of stuff, even if it feels like, oh my God, you want me to do that. At the beginning, I wasn't sure how well I'd do it, but I love giving it a go, because, well, partly because I have witnessed so many members of my community trying to navigate life inside, outside of police. So, and while they're inside as well, and they really the pain and the tiredness and the how much energy it takes to pick yourself back up. I was really amazed. So I love working in this space. Anything I can do to try and rectify some of the situations, but also every time I do something like this, it's healing for myself as well. That's one of the reasons why I do peer work, is because some of the stigmatized trauma and stuff that I've experienced, every time I do something and tell my story or have an engagement with someone and get them to access healthcare, I feel healed as well. So it's a win-win, I think.
Great. Now, so the process itself, Meera, I know that it wasn't smooth sailing at some points. As I think you referred to it, it was sometimes a bit of a case of writing by committee, which is very difficult for an artist to deal with. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was like, the process in developing these for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing that was very obvious was that, yes, it was going to be a very mediated process and a collaborative one. And also that, you know, ethics were, you know, a really major consideration. I mean, they always are, and that's kind of area of interest for me, kind of emerging out of my trauma work. So I'm always really, and as somebody who's written a lot of kind of memoir and some degree of biography, etc., and written about, you know, my own traumatic history, which of course is never just an individual one, they're shared histories, which means writing about other people's involvement in those events. So, you know, the ethical side of things is not, you know, that was territory I'm already interested in and oriented toward, but this was a very different way of working with it, like literally a committee kind of reviewing and then, you know, running past the community, which I was really pleased about as well, because one of the big challenges coming from a kind of creative practice point of view with representing other people's experiences in this kind of context, when it's actually based on research and it's really about getting these voices out there that are so marginalized, that are so unheard, and that are and where there's so much so many other people kind of constructing their identities for them. So when that's the case, there was this, I really felt very keenly that responsibility to have a process that had as much integrity as possible. So I was really glad those checks and balances were in there and very happy to work with them. The sticky point comes, you know, everybody in a process like that has a different perspective. So, you know, I know for you, Kerryn, and for people on your team, your perspective was you wanted to get there were certain sort of aspects of the traditional research that you wanted to really come out in the non-traditional representations, right? So you would sort of push for certain angles, and then I would have to be pushing back a little bit to protect the integrity of the piece as a creative work. So, you know, I think there's always going to be a degree of unavoidable tension in that process. And the most important thing is that it's productive and obviously respectful, and I think we managed both of those. So
Absolutely.
well done us. And we still talk to each other, so I think it worked, you know. But yeah, I was really pleased. It was also really important to me, like when I did send it out for publication, I needed to be, you know, I had a little blurb attached, so basically framing it, very clearly stating that this was a collaborative. And I actually co-authored, I acknowledged the participants of the project as co-authors, because, you know, I can't possibly, I can't claim sole authorship of this work. The work I did was to, you know, very selectively draw on the interview transcripts and to create a narrative. That was what I wanted to do, was, you know, I wanted to create a character, composite character, a narrative, a composite narrative, and to really try and use the creative sort of toolkit to get across the lived experience and the effective labour of having to navigate, you know, such a convoluted, hostile to some degree, sort of institutional and structural setup.
So yeah, I mean, I don't envy you the task that you did. Bindi, how did it feel to you to play the character that somebody else has written here, especially as, you know, you've mentioned that it does hold some proximate experience with your own life as well.
You know, it was I could have a bit more fun with it actually, because it wasn't mine, even though there are echoes within it of things I've experienced. I did feel like I was holding, like, you know, several people's experiences, squashing them into something and sort of pushing it out there maybe. So it's maybe experiences that a lot of people have experienced. You know, we're taking common denominator stuff in people's lives, and so I could relax a little bit more. There wasn't that you know, pain sitting right behind it. It was more of a memory that I was reliving. Or that's kind of how I thought of it. It was like I was thinking back to something. But yeah, it was. I really enjoyed it actually. It was. I didn't realize it was so long listening back to it when we recorded it.
No, it's not. It goes so quickly.
Yeah, it was so fun. Like the time that you're speaking, and I was listening back, thinking, "Wow, it's actually really long and quite a in-depth thing." My memory of it is quite short. It was, yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was such a great way to deliver a story that I think so many people will just be nodding their heads along with and going, yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. Look, I mean, absolutely. The other thing to reiterate here is that each of these performers for the three pieces were stuck in a recording studio with me. It's a very tiny space. You know, they had to, they remarkably, everyone did an exceptional job. There was very little editing of final takes. It was just sort of perfect. But, you know, it's an exhausting time, you know, to sit there and to get the pitch right. I mean, and I hear the emotion in your voice, Bindi, and I hear the exhaustion, you know, in your voice. So you've done amazing work with that. I guess the final sort of question that I want to ask you both is about your feelings about the final product and where you wanted to see it go. And, you know, what's the value of this type of research for people who use drugs and people who have a history of incarceration? What benefits do you see in doing this? Would you do it again? We'll start again with Meera, just to keep everything.
Yes. I'm sorry, I think I did forget to say originally that I'm zooming in as an uninvited guest on Gadigal land. So yes, would I do it again? Oh, absolutely, I would, for sure. I mean, you know, I think it's really exciting development. I'd really like to see a lot more of it in more disciplines. I mean, you know, of course, I'm a card carrying, you know, advocate for creative writing, for the arts, and for, you know, and a lot of my scholarly interest in writing on writing and literature is about really the agency it has for doing really important social and political work. So, and particularly around social justice. So, yeah, I would just love to see more of it. I really hope that this has, I mean, I don't know sort of quite what's happened. I'd love to hear, I know there was an evaluation process done, and I would really like to hear something more about that, because I don't feel like I have a sense of what's happened to it from that point. But yeah, so definitely be up for it again. What was the other part of the question, Kerryn? I've forgotten.
I just say, what's your hopes for this?
Oh, my hopes, yeah. Well, I mean, obviously I would hope that, you know, that it really just breaks through some of that really, really tired narrative around people with histories of drug use being I think visibility, more than anything, visibility, that those voices actually get out there and have an opportunity to communicate to the community and in the community directly, and to communicate their reality in a way that that really forces people to connect with it. And that's really what I prioritised in crafting the piece, was that thing of, well, for me, affect was the key. You know, getting people to feel, you know, so getting them out of that sort of all the preconceptions and the judgments and the stuff about, you know, people who aren't working, sucking up taxpayers' dollars and all that crap, and just like, excuse me, imagine, you know, the empathy kind of stretch into what this lived experience must be like for somebody who is coming from a history of, you know, domestic violence, from drug use and coercive control, and there's very likely a very, you know, quite a long, quite possibly a childhood trauma history there, as we know is so prevalent in people with problematic drug use. So it's, you know, for me, it's just like breaking down that as much as possible using creative means, and really just foregrounding the voices and the experiences of those people.
Yeah, absolutely. Bindi, it's the same questions. What
Yeah.
and what value do you see in it?
The value, you know, it's that saying, you know, if you can see it, you can be it. Yeah. Well, it's kind of a bit like that. You often feel like you're stupid or for not achieving something, or there's something wrong with you because you can't make it to this appointment and that appointment and get by on this amount of money, and you're giving yourself such a hard time that listening to somebody else going through it and they're not doing it either kind of makes you feel, oh, okay, so it is hard. It gives them legitimacy for it being difficult, and maybe they can take a little bit of the, you know, giving themselves a hard time away a little bit and going, okay, if other people find this difficult as well, I think that is hugely beneficial, because for some, quite often, and I think this is very specific to people that use drug and alcohol, is that you feel that you are somehow the only one that can't do something. Everyone else is succeeding and you're stupid or less or inferior or something. There's something wrong with you for why you can't get it together. So I think
something really powerful in the collective there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I have some good news.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Bindi.
No, I don't know about hope. I just think more of this should be done. A lot of people can't read, and listening, like having something said to them, is a great way of educating people about stuff rather than reading it.
Yeah.
Can I just add something quickly, Kerryn?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, ideally, obviously, and this is obviously, I think your priority perhaps as well is really what would be ideal outcome of this is change at the kind of policy and institutional level, right? So, you know, when I say getting the voices into the community, I mean that as a kind of first step, but really it's those people in the bureaucracy, it's the people who are making those decisions, who are sitting there so many light years removed from the lived realities on the ground, you know, moving these chess pieces of services and, you know, what around, like, you know, it's a very kind of abstracted exercise for them, and they aren't confronted with the realities of these people or their voices. So I think, you know, I would love to hear if you've managed to get any reach into that sort of terrain. Have you got news?
Well, this is what we're going to turn to now. I also just did want to acknowledge that Carla, who is the lead acting investigator on this project, has dropped in 2 links to the traditional publications. So the academic, often quite boring, sorry, apologies for the authors, but so each of the themes did actually match up with some of the academic outputs that we did as well, so that there's a really good, so Carla's picked me up on that. I'm going to be in trouble later, everyone. But what I want to do now is invite Tim. Tim has led the piece where we actually use that narrative as a public intervention to try and change people's opinions. So we've got some new emerging data on that we can share with you today. And then hopefully we'll have some time for a bit of a chat with everyone. So I'll hand over to Tim.
Great, thanks, Kerryn. Just checking my screen sharing properly again. Fantastic. So it's over the next sort of 10 minutes or so, I'll do a quick whirlwind tour over this intervention project we ran off the back of this creative piece that we've heard about so far. So it's going to be really, really quick. We collected a lot of data and there's actually quite a lot of detail. This is just the high level stuff to give a bit of an overview of what we found so far. And obviously with a bit more in-depth analysis to come as we go. So basically what we did was we used that creative piece that we've seen today as the basis for an intervention with a sample of the Australian public. So on this slide here, we've got a breakdown of the 3 groups that we had within the intervention study. So we had a control group and the intervention group listed there at the bottom, and then what we call the neutral control, or apparently what Kerryn would call the boring control, just kind of as a point of comparison, presenting the research findings in a more traditional format. So we had over 2,000 participants start at baseline, and we had over 1,000 all the way through to the follow-up stage of this project, which was fantastic. To have over 350 people at that final stage across each of the groups means that we're able to see some pretty significant findings, and we're also going to be able to do some really meaningful analyses moving forward as well. So just to give a bit of an overview of the people we had participate in this intervention study, average age of around 58 years with quite a range, youngest participant 18, ranging all the way through to 90 years of age. We had a roughly 50-50 split of males and females, and very small number of non-binary or different gender identifying participants. And also vast majority, over 90%, identifying as heterosexual. And you can see just the small breakdowns across other sexual identities on this slide. In terms of education, we had quite a spread. Roughly 1/3 had completed high school or lower education, another third with certificate or diploma level, and another third either undergraduate or postgraduate education as their highest qualification. Also just wanted to point out on the right-hand side of this slide, the employment and income spread. This is where we sort of see a little bit of a skew, and just something that's important for us to keep in mind when we're looking at how people have responded. We did have quite a high proportion of retired participants, so over 40% indicated they were retired, and close to 45% with personal incomes of less than $40,000 a year. So in terms of how that represents the overall national population, we can see a little bit of a skew there. So just something to keep in mind, but yeah, it hasn't necessarily impacted the importance of the main findings we're seeing from this study. We also asked participants about their own lived experience. So when we're talking about attitudes towards people of any particular group, we know that lived experience and personal contact with people within those communities is going to be an important factor. And really what we saw was that within our sample, there was very limited lived experience of the issues that we're talking about. So around 1/4 had ever used illicit drugs in their lifetime, but then only about 5% had ever injected drugs or ever been in prison themselves. So really the vast majority had no personal contact, no personal lived experience of being in prison or injecting drug use themselves. And we also asked about personal contact, so whether they had family members, friends, colleagues who had ever injected drugs or had ever been in prison. And again, you can see a similar trend here that overwhelmingly, 80% and higher saying that across each of these groups, no, never, and no awareness of any family member, any friend, any colleagues who had ever injected drugs or had ever been in prison. So really predominantly the sample we're talking about here are those from those segments of the broader community who don't have that contact with this particular group that we're focusing on with the intervention. So this was the procedure for the study. It was all conducted online. All participants came into the study and then were randomly allocated to one of those three groups I mentioned before, the intervention, the neutral or bland or boring control group, or the standard control group. Everyone completed baseline measures. I'll go through a couple of those over the next few slides, but essentially most of those measures were looking at various attitudes specifically targeted towards people who had recently been released from prison and had a history of injecting drug use. So we're looking at both of those factors at the same time, rather than trying to differentiate between injecting drug use and history of incarceration. We were trying to get people to think about that group of people who experience both of those issues simultaneously. Following the baseline measures, people from the intervention group watched that video that we all watched earlier on today. And those in the neutral group watched a standard presentation of results. So just the typical way research findings would normally be presented around emerging themes, what we did, this is what we found, and so on. Those two groups then completed the same measures again to see if there'd been any change immediately after watching the video. The control group got a bit of an easy ride. They didn't have to do the second lot of measures. And then at 3 months, we followed everyone up to see what the changes had been over that time. Just to give you an indication of what attitudes kind of look like at baseline, we asked all participants whether they would behave negatively towards other people because of injecting drug use or because of their incarceration in prison. And you can see here there's quite a spread, but actually quite high levels of people saying that to some extent, yes, I would behave negatively towards somebody else because they inject drugs or because they've been in prison. 78% for injecting drug use and 71% for incarceration. So really we are seeing a group where there's some level of negative attitude quite prominent across the sample. Now, over the next couple of slides, I'm just going to show how various attitudes changed over the three separate time points. The first one, we're looking at a measure of stigmatizing attitudes. So higher scores represent more stigmatizing, more negative attitudes. What we really want to see is a reduction in stigma. And that's what we're seeing here with this attitudes measure. As would be expected, you can see with the yellow line, the control group from baseline through to follow-up showed no change. They had no intervention, so that's what we would expect to see. For both the bland control and the intervention group in the red and the green, from baseline to post-intervention, we saw a significant reduction in their stigmatizing attitudes straight after watching the video. And that effect was noticeably stronger with the intervention group as opposed to the bland control. By the time we got to follow-up, you can see that things have started to bounce back. The bland control have gone back to a level where there's no significant difference from their baseline levels. The intervention group is still slightly lower than baseline, so we're still seeing some residual effect, but you can see that it is heading back towards those baseline levels. We had a measure of distance, which is basically the idea of, I want to keep my distance from these people. I wouldn't go to a shop if someone from this community was working there. I don't want to work with this group of people. And again, we're seeing the same pattern here. That desire for distance reduced for both of those both the bland control and the intervention group. Again, the intervention showing a more significant shift, but then both of those reverting back to baseline levels after 3 months. Similar picture here in terms of empathy, except it's flipped around because empathy is a good thing. And what we want to see is that empathy towards this group is going to increase. And again, yeah, that is what we saw. Control group stayed stable from baseline through to follow-up. And for both of the other groups, an increase in empathy straight after watching the video before reverting back to baseline at follow-up. I also just wanted to quickly, really quickly skim over this idea of scenarios that we included in the survey. So we presented people with hypothetical scenarios and asked them how much they agreed or disagreed with the behaviour that was depicted in there. So this is just one example. We had a few of them throughout the survey. And basically, we're talking about someone who's been recently released from prison, required to attend drug testing appointments But then when they fail to attend one without notice, they get told, off you go and find another service. We're not going to help you anymore. And ask people, how much do you agree or disagree with this decision, to tell them that they need to find an alternative service. And basically what we see here is reflective of what we saw on the previous slides, that straight after the intervention, yes, there's a slight shift in a positive direction, but the narrative video, that effect is a little bit stronger. Whereas in the neutral control, really what we saw is more that people who were sort of mid-range, neutral, unsure, they started to say, okay, yeah, that's probably not okay, and then revert back. Whereas in the narrative video, some of the people who agreed with it at baseline started to have a bit of a shift, think, oh, maybe that's not so okay. But again, for both of them, by follow-up, we're reverting back to baseline levels. So that same pattern happening across a range of different measures. So quick summary, while we still have a little bit of time left for questions afterwards, really what we're essentially seeing from this intervention is some immediate positive changes after watching each of the videos, whether it was the narrative version or whether it was that bland control. But the changes in the group who saw the narrative version were noticeably larger compared to the neutral version. For both of those, there was that tendency to revert back to baseline levels after 3 months. So early stages in terms of our analysis and what we're going to be able to pull out of all of this, but essentially the emerging findings are that this kind of narrative intervention really does have the potential to influence public opinions, but it's not just a one-stop shop. The messaging really does need to be reinforced over time to ensure that people can take hold of that message and keep it front of mind in order to have a meaningful and long-term change. And there are our acknowledgements. Kerryn, I'll hand it back to you now.
Great. So I'm happy to chair the Q&A. If we just drop down the slides, so either drop your question in the chat or raise a hand so I can see and I can ask you to unmute and ask your question directly. We do have one initial question. Just wondering if those prisoners have children. Are they allowed to live with their children immediately after they get out of jail? Okay, so I can probably answer that one. In terms of our participant sample, we had 15 women participate, and some of them did have children. In many cases, they had their children either forcibly removed by the state or they were handed over to family or other kin to look after. In fact, getting children back was a very strong theme throughout the transcripts. It was a motivation to stay out of jail and to get their drug use to a point where it was manageable or abstain. And so there's a little bit of a rock and a hard place here, because often housing, for example, is dependent on, they want to get adequate housing so they can get the children back. But the continual trauma of having their children removed is actually prompting sometimes them to use some substances to cope. And so it's a really hard thing, I think, for people who have been justice involved, who do have children. There are a couple of instances where they did release from jail and go back. And that's where they usually had stable housing, both before and then after the prison term. And I think that's the sort of really the key thing that we want to push home there, is that there's an intersection with housing here in relationship to injecting drug use, recidivism, and also family supports and things like that. I've also got a question here from Tanya. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question.
I just thought, hang on, I'm someone from a background with my neurological birth defect, right? I don't take any drugs or anything like that. I've been abused and trauma in different parts of my life. But I'm trying to change the narrative of the way, like, not only for people with visible disability, but even those with those taking drugs. Even though, yes, I'm born with 2 genetic brain disorders and found out late at night, but then it's those people, even though they're taking drugs, but they don't know what they're dealing with. But then, even though they experience trauma, as you said, Kerryn, but it's also they themselves probably were born with something neurologically like I was. But we got a system within the government that, or even within the house system and all those other ways, that closely control on those like ourselves and other cohorts, because we're not allowed to express ourselves or even give out, listen to us with what our needs are. And sometimes other people don't know how to express their needs like the way I am. I had to work hard to who I am today just to get my voice heard or try to change the narrative one way or another of how that within society, everyone, even though they have issues, but can't we all be accepted and learn off each other and, you know?
Yeah, look, I'd like to actually throw this over to Meera or Bindi in how that they can convey this complexity of life in those narratives. But in terms of what our data tells us and what the research tells us is that for many people who are incarcerated with histories of injecting drug use, there is a connection or a correlation that's not necessarily causative with mental health and other disabilities. In some cases, it's been diagnosed for those individuals who are then able to seek therapeutic interventions. But for many people, some of these issues are undiagnosed. And so we're dealing with compounding barriers and challenges of trauma, of in some cases, sometimes problematic substance use, and other times the substance use is completely manageable. But also a whole range of comorbidities that people are experiencing as well.
Thank you.
Meera, would you like to comment on how you can actually try to capture some of that complexity in the creation of a persona?
I think I think there's a lot of, from a kind of creative writing kind of literary point of view, the business of characterization and voice, I think, is what is really key to doing the work of communicating. Well, it does a lot to communicate class, to communicate identities in all sorts of different ways, and various different kind of subjective experiences, and as we've talked about, intersectional kind of disadvantage to some degree. But I think, I think it's really interesting seeing that the findings from the evaluation. I'm not at all surprised to hear that there was a positive response initially that kind of regressed, because obviously, as we all know, the attitudes are there because they're very socially embedded and very socially conditioned. So, these and they're continually reinforced in media representations, in the way that politicians talk about people in the less advantaged sections of the community. I mean, so there's so many layers and so much of that sort of work that's happening continually that we're not even necessarily conscious of. So what we're doing when we do a kind of creative intervention of any kind is we're challenging that, and we're hopefully intervening on that to generate more understanding, more empathy, more insight. But I think for a short piece, one-off short piece is never going to be equal to that task, right? So, this is why, whole novels can do more than a short piece. But even that said, I mean, it's a tricky business. There's a lot of debate in my field as to how much, can creative work do change minds and hearts, and obviously it's not simple, right? There's probably no novel or no book that anyone in the world could have written that would have stopped Hitler becoming the person that he became and doing what he did, because it's so much more than just one creative intervention that's needed. There's a structural, historic kind of element that just no creative intervention can challenge. But it is about, I think it's about, doing more of it, having more of it happening more often. And I think we see that already on social media, the way in which, for example, young First Nations voices and now have really claimed space in social media, on social media platforms. It's changing the landscape of the country. It's changing the landscape of equity in terms of, you know, certainly in terms of publishing and other sectors. But it's sustained. That's the thing. It's sustained, and those people are doing continual labour to challenge the status quo, and I think that's what it takes.
So we have a question around the ethical implications of this type of work. Carla has responded directly to that question in the chat, but I just want to add, we were very careful. Meera made me remember, you know, we had contracts that are drawn up from our legal department at the university, so that each of the writers retained their intellectual property. They retained copyright over their pieces, and essentially they just lent that copyright to us for these purposes. For the performers, we also had contracts drawn up where, you know, we're very clear about what belongs to them and what belongs to us and what we can use and in which cases. It got way more complicated when we added in Carolyn Craig, who actually works with an agent and who obviously does these kind of contractual agreements all the time. And we actually had a number of backups. So, for example, you know, if there was ever going to be a case where Carolyn had to pull from the project, we also had a backup recording of a host piece that was narrated by Professor Eileen Baldry, who has her own reputation around this area. And so I think by having the community advisory group set up from the very beginning of this, when we started first thinking about how we can translate this research into this form, was immeasurably valuable, because the contribution of their lived experience and their lived expertise was really fundamental to how we could interpret what we thought were the pertinent findings. So as Meera pointed out, you know, there were a lot of voices involved in this, a lot of stakeholders involved in this, which makes her job much more difficult. But from our perspective, it was really important to make sure that we have that ethical oversight from the community advisory group as well. And we've got another question here. Just wondering, after people get out of jail and pursue a life partner, are they obligated to declare to the people that they're dating that they have been in jail? I would say that there's no legal obligation to do so. It really depends on the quality of the relationship and what people are comfortable disclosing or not disclosing. I'd also probably point out that disclosure isn't a one-off event, that it may happen repeatedly and continually over time. And, you know, if you love someone, then does it matter that they have been formally incarcerated, I guess would be my response to that. Okay, and I think that's the last of the questions, and I can't see any hands up, which is perfect timing. Let's just take a moment now, I think, to really thank Meera and Bindi. Bindi's had to drop off the call because her computer ran out, because she's out doing outreach at the moment. So she's a very busy person. So just say thank you to Meera and Bindi for their involvement in the project, for Tim to do the amazing data analysis that I just blows my tiny little brain away, because I don't understand numbers at all. And to all of the research team that have been involved, and all the stakeholders who have been involved in this project. So thank you. Lisa, is there anything else that we should know before we wrap up?
No, that was wonderful. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. That was a great talk.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for your patience at the beginning also.
Yes, and also please feel free to email me if you have any other questions or any feedback, or if you've accessed the narratives and that you find them valuable in the work that you do. We would love to hear about it, and we will of course endeavour to share that information with all of our stakeholders so that they know where this project has gone and what its future might hold. Thank you.
Thanks. Great. Yeah, Tim, it would be nice to at some point get that some of those research evaluation findings somehow translated over to Bassett USyd, where I work, because I think it would be really interesting for people in the creative writing program to hear, you know, objective evaluation of what a kind of creative invention can do of this kind. So yeah, maybe we could talk about
Yeah.
set up some sort of event that
Yeah, we're definitely keen to share the results far and wide. So yeah, obviously we're planning to publish things as well.
right.
So, but yeah, any kind of workshop or anything that where people are going to be interested.
I mean, just as a kind of interesting little bit of info for you from Creative Writing Academy. It's always kind of had to fight for its legitimacy. You know, it's quite established now, but it's taken time, and there are still people in the sector that see creative writing as this sort of indulgence, or it doesn't do as much important work as scholarly research. And, we're constantly having to push back against that. So I think there is a way in which it could be really useful for my discipline to have more of that perspective. And we don't do these sorts of projects generally ourselves. So not as much as we'd like. So let's talk about it.
Yeah, definitely. Keep in touch. We'll definitely keen to share. So wherever we can have that conversation, let's make it happen.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thanks.